Thank you for tuning in to another segment of Remarkable Portsmouth, a series of short documentaries about people, places, and things woven into the historical tapestry of Portsmouth. In this segment, we'll meet or reacquaint you with Bertha Winborne Edwards, the first librarian of the Portsmouth Color Community Library appointed by the Portsmouth City Council in 1945. The Portsmouth Color Community Library operated until 1963, when the main public library was integrated.
My name is Bertha Winborne Edwards, and I am a retired librarian from Portsmouth, Virginia. Now, my father worked as a chauffeur for one of the prominent doctors in Portsmouth, Dr. Barlow. He started working as a chauffeur and companion for Dr. Barlow when he was 14. I was born in Portsmouth, Virginia, June 8, 1920, the third of 5 children, Carrie Joanne Winborne and Annie Sue Coleman. But my daddy was a little more forward than most of the people, and he would go up to the fence and talk to her when she was a teenager for several years. And her people, her folks there, Big Mama, didn't want her to mingle with the blacks. They just didn't want her to have anything to do with it. But they did let my daddy stand at the gate and talk to her a while, and that's how he got to marry her. Dr. Barlow owned houses, owned a lot of row houses that Negroes lived in Portsmouth. Portsmouth was full of row houses, and he gave my daddy privilege to pick out any place or any house that he wanted to live in. And he picked out this house on the corner of First Avenue and Queen, which was once a storefront, and the house part in the back. He had the use of the car, of Dr. Barlow's car, being the chauffeur. They let him use the car on weekends for the family. And we always would go out every Sunday somewhere in Portsmouth. We knew about the City Park and the Barlow's Farm and Shea Terrace and Carney Farm because my daddy was chauffeur and he went to those places and all he knew, and he would take us around. Growing up, we were fortunate because my father was working for Dr. Barlow, and Dr. Barlow had children and grandchildren, and they seemed to have liked him a lot. And we had magazines, always had magazines and books and all in our home, and some encyclopedias and all, when we couldn't afford it, and other people probably didn't have them. And I remember getting a lot of postal cards. They went to the old country. They went to visit the old country, which we later found it was Europe. And they brought back pictures of famous places and shrines and all. And of course, when we would get things, we would take them to school, to our teachers, and our teachers would use them. But we always had reading material. I attended I.C. Norcom Elementary School and I.C. Norcom High School. After that, I spent a year out. I stayed home a year because I had a sister. My oldest sister was in Hampton Institute, and she only had 1 year to go. And of course, my mother, couldn't afford to have 2 of us in school. So when I just had to go, I think they were starting Norfolk State, the unit. Reverend Johnson was instrumental in working with the unit and the people over in Portsmouth, trying to get as many students to go. I did not want to go to the unit. I wanted to go to Hampton Institute. I was fascinated with the library. Oh, Hampton's library was beautiful, because in the high school, in Norcom High School at that time, we did not have a library. The little library we had, consisted of a set of encyclopedia. The A encyclopedia was half gone. The XYZs, the pages were gone. It was on a table, and they had 1 or 2 dictionaries. And it was located in the front office of the principal's office, in the front room of the principal's office, where the secretary stayed. And when we had to look up information, we would have to go, very few of us looked up information, because whenever I'd go to look up something, nobody would be there. But in the meantime, we had a set of encyclopedia at home, that we let the neighborhood use, and we would use ourselves when we had to bring in assignments. And when I went to Hampton and saw this library with all these beautiful books and all, it just fascinated me. In the meantime, they were offering a course. I went in as a double social studies major. Well, the library school, the black library school, the only one, was Hampton Institute at that time. They were closing it down and were moving to Atlanta, Georgia. School of Library was Atlanta University was taking over the library school, accredited library school. But they still had teachers there, and they were still offering courses. So they had, on the curriculum, they had courses they offered to teachers, majoring in other things, to become teacher librarians. I decided I would take library science because I liked the library. So I was majoring in, a double major in social studies and library. And of course, in major library, we had classes in the library and learned all about the library. And I just fell in love with the library. And that's how I became a teacher librarian. The people in Portsmouth were planning on getting a library, a public library for blacks. They didn't have a public library for blacks. And of course, my minister and the people that knew that I had been to Hampton and had library training, I was a teacher librarian there, not a public library, teacher librarian. And they asked me would I be willing to accept a job as librarian. I said, to what? We didn't have a library. They had plans. They were going to ask the city to build a library for the blacks. And they went around and collected $1 from as many people as they could to buy a plot of land that belonged to the Fourth Baptist Church. The committee went to our city council and asked for a black library for the Portsmouth to be built and maintained by the city. They said they would do it, but they did not have a suitable site. You got a card saying, I'm a member of the library committee, and people paid $1. I forgot how much the lot cost, but they bought the lot from Reverend Scott. They deeded the deed to the city, took the deed down and went the second time and asked them they wanted a library to be built and maintained for blacks. I said, we have that place. And they said, okay, we have the place. We will build your library and maintain it. So I was hired by the city council as librarian. They took me through the mail. I was not a public librarian as such, but they wanted to know, who was I, or my family's name and what school I go to and so forth. But there were 2 or 3 librarians in the city of Portsmouth who were capable of taking the job, but they were in the schools.
My name is May Breckenridge Haywood. I knew Bertha because I'm a librarian. I'm a retired school librarian. And I knew Bertha Winborne Edwards because she too was a librarian.
My name is Dean Burgess. I was director of libraries for the city. I'm also the historian, sort of the city, having written the history of the city. Mrs. Bertha Edwards was my friend and mentor from the first day that I became a clerk at the public library, all the way through most of my career as library director. She had been director of the African American Library.
Got a letter saying that I had been hired as librarian, public librarian in Portsmouth, Virginia, for color. The head of the library committee took me to the building, walked in, nothing, just the building, nothing but the building, and shelves. So I started the library. I called it my library. I ordered the furniture, the books. In the meantime, they had a reading room at St. James Episcopal Church. They had closed it because the money had stopped. But anyway, they had books, I guess 200 or 300 books there. And they told me I could use those books to start with. Of course I did. I went there and had to wash them up and could use most of them because they were kind of dusty, but they were books. And the city gave us some money to start. And I was able to start a library. And we ended up, we had a little over 10,000 books.
As the librarian first in a library that was separate and surely unequal, I think she appointed herself as the point person to bridge that gap.
I knew that the state gave money for library services. The white library was getting all the money. And since we were opening We were 1/3 of the population. 1/3 of the population was black. So I applied for 1/3 of the state money that they were giving Portsmouth and got it. And I got it because I found out what was required to be eligible, to be accredited by the state. And wherein the white librarian was very nice to me and helped. And she gave me some of their books. Of course, some of their books were used books, but she would buy books and buy 2 copies, just between the 2 of us. And she would give me a copy, and she'd keep a copy, because they got more money for books than we did, you know. But she was very, very useful. But she told me to be sure to stock up on fiction, because most of our people read fiction. But I knew what was required for the library to be accredited. And I obtained the list of reference books to make a library accredited. So I bought the reference books. And we had the accredited reference books, the main encyclopedias and atlases and handbooks and so forth were in our library. And when they came to inspect our library to see if we were eligible for the money, they were surprised because I had a very, very good reference collection. Also, some fiction too, you know, and nonfiction. While I was there, I had a section of books by and about Negroes. I had a special section of handbooks by and about Negroes that was used. And I always say our library supplemented the school library because the schools didn't have a nice library.
The school at that time was I.C. Norcom High School, which was just a few, maybe a block away or within the block. And students would go to that library often to check out books. And she welcomed them. They would go basically during lunchtime and sometimes after school. And they would speak about how the librarian assisted them in finding books, encouraged them to read, encouraged them by other activities.
But in our library, we not only served the blacks, but we served anybody. Being on South Street, cars were passing through, and we had people to stop to ask for directions. The little kids who lived in a housing project, a white housing project down the street, stopped. We let them use books. Now, they wouldn't let our black children use the white library. Well, the white library was situated downtown in a building, in a finance building, in the back of the courthouse. And their space was not as large as the space that we had, although they had the space for reading, although they had books all around everywhere. But they didn't have the table and the chair space that we had in our library. And when anyone would go there, they would say, go to the other library. I wouldn't let them use them. But we had 1 or 2 kids who would go there, and they wouldn't let them use the library. And they were real nice to me when I wanted anything, I needed anything. I could always go there and use them. But I knew about the interlibrary loan system. And being state-supported and the interlibrary loan system and getting information from my former teachers in Hampton Law, I was on the interlibrary loan system. So anybody who came to my library, if I didn't have the book, I could interlibrary loan the book from anywhere, any college, library, or anywhere, you know. People who came to our library may not have seen too many books. I want you to know one thing, I would not let them check the book out. I would let them sit there and copy it, so it would stay in the library. I was real, novel, I would have to let them take it out to read. But most of the reference questions, I let them use it there, and I would help them. I've always liked history, and I remember the things that I did when I was home. And my daddy used to talk about, this used to be this way, it used to be the other way. A long time ago, we did this. And I used to read the columns, the Lee Rogers column in the paper. I just liked history, and I just, started collecting.
If it were not for her role trying to make sure that others were aware of the contributions that African Americans have made and recognize them, then they would just sit on the shelf and you never know. So I think she had a big impact on making sure that African Americans were represented and that the public, the children, the people, everybody knew about it. Because otherwise, if there's no one to share it, how are you going to learn about it?
And anything I saw that was of interest, I cut it out and kept. And I noticed that while I was in the library, other people would bring in history of their family's history, old receipts. We even got some receipts where some of the people had a receipt for buying a slave in Portsmouth on Washington Street, and the date and name and so forth. And it was interesting to me. They brought it to the library to keep. So I said, I should do something for the blacks. So I began getting the history of the black churches. You know, when they have their programs, I would get the history part and bind it up. I started collecting the history of the churches, and then I thought about writing the history of the different neighborhoods in Portsmouth. And I interviewed a lot of the older people here in Portsmouth. And I found out the people who were the first in the little book, the first blacks to do this, do the other, the first black teacher, the first playground, where it was located, and so forth. And I got it all in good order to keep in the library. We had a local history room, so that was for the blacks. And I was lucky, I was fortunate enough to get part of Lee F. Rogers' collection. Now, Mr. Lee F. Rogers was the correspondence for the Portsmouth Star newspaper. It was the black correspondence for the Portsmouth Star newspaper. And he took over from Jeffrey Wilson. And Jeffrey Wilson was back in the 1800s. He was the correspondent. And of course, when he died, Lee Rogers took over. But Jeffrey Wilson, in his column, he wrote about blacks. You know, he just had a column in the back part of the paper, who was married, who died, who was sick, who went to school, and so forth.
Without Mrs. Edwards, it would have been a very huge loss. Mrs. Edwards was the bridge between finding out about information about local African Americans, that she made sure that she was the person to get that information to them. So I take her to be just like a giant. She was small in stature, but big with wanting students and the community to learn by reading and getting that information together, making it available in the library was a big thing.
And he died, Lee Rogers took over, would do the same thing. And they would have in there 25 years ago what happened, 5 years ago, and so forth. Well, while I was at the library, I started thinking and said, during my spare time, maybe I could start collecting some of that information. And I did. During my spare time at the library, I would go back through the microfilm. The newspapers would put on film, you know, and I would go back and look at that column and record several things from that column. I also would come over to the Norfolk Library and look in the Journal and Guide. And would look at the headlines of the Journal and Guide, look at the Portsmouth News and so forth. And anything that I thought was interesting, I just did alone. I would copy it down and put it together and compile several books with information like that. Now, the information that people brought there about slave purchase and all were given to the head librarian, because she had the catalog department to do all that. When I interviewed anybody, I would do the same. I would bring it and give it to her, or her to put together. The library has a local history room. And in that local history room, there's all the information they could get, pictures or anything they could get about Portsmouth. And of course, what I brought in was about Negroes in Portsmouth. Yet the history is still there. I left when I retired in 1980. I left 2 volumes, History of Blacks in Portsmouth. Included in that is the history of the Portsmouth Community Library, our first library, how we got started and how I got started. The story of the Julius Kellogg story. He was a Norcom boy who broke the basketball scandal. We had a polygamist in Portsmouth one time, which gave a lot of attention, in Mount Hermon. That history. I have the history of black baseball in Portsmouth, the history of the Capitol Theater in Portsmouth, the history of Lincolnsville, that was a black community, Emmanuel AME Church, the history of Truxton. Truxton was one of the first housing projects to be built for World War I for blacks. And I interviewed a lot of people, and I have some of my interviews there. I also wrote a biographical sketch of several of the people who were here, the principals of the schools, W.E. Riddick, Mrs. Weaver, some of the older teachers that were here, the first council members of Portsmouth Council, City Council, in the olden days, Mr. Judkins, Mr. John T. Fisher, and so forth. And then that was doing Reconstruction. I have that information. And then in the most recent years, Dr. Hawley and Raymond Turner ran for city council. And because they were the first council members, but not the very first, because they're doing Reconstruction. We had all the blacks who held office here in Portsmouth. And I just started reading up and studying, and I would put things down and I would write them as a fact. Now, what I did in the books, it wasn't my writing as such, it was a compilation. I compiled information of interest about blacks. And I had people to tell me things that happened. I have a nice little history that was written by Mr. James Choate way back. He was a barber, and he has relatives still living. How Portsmouth was in those days. A description of where the slaves were sold on Washington Street, how the city looked, how the city was surrounded by water. The naval shipyard was separate from the city. Lincolnsville was the oldest neighborhood. And beyond Chestnut Street was county. And Mount Hermon and Brighton, there was the county. And I have pictures and information about Portsmouth.
When she came to this library, the public library, she did the same thing to see that African American history was a part of the bigger picture. So that's the vision that she had. And everybody doesn't walk like that. Everybody does not walk like that. They walk their path and they don't spread it out. But she had that vision.
And she saved all of this Black history material that would otherwise never be in the library.
And I'm kind of fascinated me to get it, to read it. And it's all housed in the local history room. And I'm happy to say that the librarian there says that when we have Black History Month and Black History Week, the kids use it. I left word that they could use, I have nothing copyrighted. They could use anything that's there and just make copies of it. I did request that they would not take the books out of the library, but I have a 2-volume history of blacks in Portsmouth and 7 volumes of a pictorial history of blacks in Portsmouth. There are pictures of Norcom High School and the old houses and the Shriners parades and the Memorial Day parades that the blacks had. They had a white parade and a black parade. Pictures and information who took part in the Memorial Day parades. The history of fraternal orders in Portsmouth. History of musicians in Portsmouth. And of course I said the black churches. And anything that I kind of thought was of interest, I wrote it down in copy form and put it together, So it's a lot of information. A lot of times I hear people say, you don't have no history. If they would go to the library and ask them to let them see the material that was left there on blacks, if they just say Mrs. Edwards' books, they would show them, show it to them. Also, when I was there, I started collecting their yearbooks for all of the high schools in Portsmouth, and especially the yearbooks of Norcom High School.
In 1960, the state decided that mayors were doing things like putting their aunts and their daughters as library directors with no training and no management experience. And so they decided to require licensing, just like when they license a teacher. Now, in order to avoid chaos, they issued a license to everybody who was then working as a director of a library, with one exception, Mrs. Bertha Edwards. Now, I believe that the reason they didn't issue her a license was because of her race.
The first my library, Portsmouth Community Library, closed in 1963.
When the two segregated libraries were brought together in 1962 in the main library, the new library on Court Street, it would be reasonable that she would be director or assistant director. Because she lacked that license, she couldn't have those positions. It was a bitter pill, I'm sure, for her to take, but I never heard her say anything negative about it. It was a terrible loss for the city because she would have been wonderful as a library director or assistant director. But in a way, for the rest of us, for all of us in the city, it might have been a good thing, because then she wasn't hidden away in the offices of the library. She had her desk right in the middle of the downtown library, and every person who came in, child, adult, black, white, had her love and her compassion and her fascination and love of learning and her ability to change you. And I've got to tell you, she changed my life, and I think she changed the life of many people in the city of Portsmouth as a result of that.
Dr. Holly and Dr. Hugo Owens tried to integrate, they were leaders here, and they tried to integrate the white library. They wanted the white library to open up to blacks too. They would not build it, not unless it served the whole population, which means the population of blacks and white. So they discussed it, and they found out there was no need of keeping our little library open because it was in a downtown area. It was too close to be a branch. So they decided to bring the two black librarians at the community library, Mrs. Falk and myself, to the main library.
Mrs. Edwards was such a leader in the black community because of her position as director of the black library that she suddenly made the combined library really work as a full community library. She not only brought materials in that were important to the African American community in Portsmouth, but she was the catalyst for bringing all the African Americans into the library as well.
Of course, I was head librarian at the Portsmouth Community Library. When I came to the other library, the white librarian was head librarian at the Portsmouth Public Library. And I became a reference librarian, put in reference in the reference department, and they put my assistant, Miss Charlotte Driver, in the lending department. The old building, they wanted to tear it down. The city council gave Reverend Harvey Johnson, the pastor of Ebenezer Church then, he asked for the building. Now he and his wife were on the library committee when it first opened. At least Reverend Johnson was the one who suggested that I become librarian because he knew that I had taken library science. Well, the city council told him he could have the building if he would move it. So he moved it, and he didn't have to move it very far because the library was right there. But it's there, and people go by and they know that's the library. The library was a challenge, and I pride myself in founding the library.
I think that Bertha was passionate because, you know, in life there are people that do some things and some people that have this idea that they want to do more than just regular. And I think Mrs. Bertha Edwards was like that. She wanted to embrace people. She wanted to embrace, of course, students because the school was near, and she wanted them to come into this library. She wanted them to read. She wanted them to learn because they could be a better place. They could be a better person. And yes, we are better people because of Mrs. Bertha Edwards.
Mrs. Edwards was dedicated to changing all of us, to making us better people. If you didn't know her, you missed something really valuable in your life.
I always wanted to help people. I always liked them. I wasn't a librarian. They tell me that. You didn't sit down and say, there's the book up there. I got up and helped people. If I'd done a little to help somebody, I mean, I'm thankful, and that's what I mostly am.
Thank you for tuning in to another segment of Remarkable Portsmouth, a series of short documentaries about people, places, and things woven into the historical tapestry of Portsmouth.